Evan Sutherland's hand crushed Dr. Lena Ortiz's throat, so hard her heels left the linoleum, and the back of her skull slammed into a stainless crash cart with a metallic crack that rang down the surgical corridor. Her airway narrowed to a burning straw. Her fingers clawed at his wrist, nails scraping expensive leather, while his other forearm pinned her shoulder blades against a wall chart labeled Euthanasia Protocols. She tasted copper where her lip had split on impact, and blood slipped down her chin in warm threads. Bright against the pale green scrub top she had started this shift in 6 hours earlier. The corridor smelled like chlorhexidine, floor wax, and panic held in place by policy. 3 feet to her right, a clear syringe hovered over Ghost's front leg. The plunger was already primed. The needle trembled just above the clipped fur of his cephalic vein as the attorney in a charcoal suit leaned in and snapped, "Destroy the dog now." No one moved. Ghost stood square on the polished tile, 85 pounds of tan and black saddleback that had turned dark as iron in shadow, his ears pinned forward, shoulders locked. He did not lunge. He did not bark. A low sound rolled out of his chest, steady and subterranean. A warning that had nothing theatrical in it. His leash dragged from a dropped hand and made a soft, dragging hiss across the floor every time he shifted weight toward Lena. Evan laughed into her face, close enough that she caught whiskey and mint. "My father owns this hospital," he said, and tightened his grip to prove that ownership included oxygen. "You sign the destruction order, or I make sure you never practice again." The words came in fragments because her trachea was compressed, and each syllable hurt. "You're hurting him." He smiled wider. The attorney took 1/2 step toward Ghost, cufflinks flashing under fluorescent lights, and said to the nearest tech, "Witness this. Aggressive dog. Immediate euthanasia authorized under liability clause." The tech looked at Lena, then at Evan's hand on her throat, then at the floor. Nobody corrected the sentence. Lena's photo badge swung between them, tapping Evan's wrist with each shuddering inhale she couldn't finish. Mateo's school picture faced outward from behind the plastic sleeve, her nephew grinning with one front tooth chipped, blue inhaler in his hand like a prize. The little card struck Evan's watch once, twice, a tiny clock counting down air she didn't have. At the far end of the corridor, double doors whispered open from records, and Drew Foster stepped out. In 2 silent strides, he reached Ghost and closed one hand on the collar, while the loose leash tail still dragged near Lena's shoes. 6 feet of scarred stillness in Navy NWU. Type 3 camouflage, shoulders broad from load-bearing years, short, dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, old pale line crossing his jaw like a map of weather he never discussed. He did not hurry. He did not announce himself. He just appeared in that narrow strip of fluorescent light between records and surgery, and the hallway's balance shifted before he spoke. Evan didn't look over. He was still watching Lena's face lose color, still performing for the room. "Do it," he told the attorney. "Now." Ghost's ears rotated hard toward Drew, then back to Evan. His body went rigid enough that muscle lines stood out under his coat. The growl deepened. Drew's hand tightened on the collar, 2 fingers under the strap, the kind of grip that said he knew exactly how much force his dog could deliver, and exactly how little he needed to use. The corridor clock above triage read 3:07 a.m. There were 21 people in hospital badges within clear sight lines of Lena's throat being crushed. 2 surgical residents still in lead aprons, 3 overnight kennel techs with clippers in their pockets, a pharmacist with unlaced shoes, an anesthetist holding a chart upside down, 4 orderlies by the supply alcove, 6 nurses from the trauma side, 2 interns, 1 security supervisor, and 1 senior administrator in a cream blazer standing by the med fridge. Not one of them touched Evan's arm. Not one of them told the attorney to lower the syringe. A resident pulled her phone halfway from her pocket, thought better of it, and slid it back in like evidence could be unseen if it was never recorded. The senior administrator opened a tablet and stared at a billing spreadsheet, thumb scrolling line items while Lena's shoes kicked once above the floor. The reflected grid lit her glasses blue. Revenue cycle variance, overnight losses, pending claims. She looked so carefully at columns and percentages that for a second it almost looked like concentration, not surrender. Lena heard one nurse whisper, "It's Sutherland," and another answer, "Don't." That was all. Evan squeezed again, and white static crowded Lena's vision at the edges. She had run chest tubes in field tents, with dust storms punching through canvas. She had packed wounds under mortar alarms. She had never felt this particular kind of helplessness, because battle had rules and this corridor had donors. Ghost shifted one step, nails clicking on tile. The attorney flinched and raised the syringe as if the movement justified him. "See?" he said louder now, eager for witnesses. "Unprovoked aggression. This is exactly why we have protocol." Drew finally spoke, voice low and level, carrying farther than shouting. "Needle down!" 3 words, no strain, no heat. But the attorney's hand paused mid-air as though the command had physical weight. Evan turned then, finally seeing the man at Ghost's shoulder. His expression moved through annoyance to recognition, to something harder, because he knew the uniform pattern even if he didn't know the history inside it. "Who let you in this hall?" he said. "This is private administration space." Drew didn't answer that question. His eyes stayed on Lena's airway, on finger placement, on carotid pressure. "Release her." The silence after that was its own sound. Lena's narrowing vision tunneled down the corridor, and, in that blurring frame, the scene felt horribly ordinary. A funded wing, a famous name, a line of trained professionals, learning again how quickly silence outran alarms. She saw Drew and Ghost held together by the kind of loyalty built under fire and repetition, and some lucid part of her understood that whatever happened in this hallway before dawn would not end here. It would tear through the Sutherland immunity layer by layer until there was nowhere left to hide. Evan barked a short laugh, trying to reclaim the room. "You don't give orders here," he said. "My father funds this wing. My name is on the doors." His grip never loosened. Lena felt her pulse hammer against his thumb. Her hands were weaker now, fingers slipping on his wrist, where sweat and blood mixed. She angled her chin the way she taught new medics to do under compression. Tiny movement to buy millimeters of space. Millimeters mattered. Breath came in a ragged thread. Somewhere behind Evan, a monitor alarm from recovery started its repetitive high tone, and nobody silenced it. The security supervisor took one step forward, stopped when Evan glanced at him, then looked at the floor. One of the interns pressed himself against the supply cabinet and stared at the emergency eye wash station, as if memorizing instructions could count as action. The pharmacist folded her clipboard against her chest with both arms and whispered a prayer she did not finish. 21 witnesses, 21 badges, 21 choices. Nobody helped. Ghost's growl rose another register, not loud, just deeper, thunder finding its line. Drew kept one hand on the collar and shifted his stance half a degree, enough that his body sat between Ghost and the syringe without blocking Lena from his sight. Discipline held. Violence, leashed by intention, held. The attorney's knuckles whitened around the plunger. "Sign it," Evan told Lena, each word punctuated by pressure. Say he attacked without cause. Say he's dangerous. She forced out two sounds. He saved. Evan shoved her head back into the cart again, hard enough to rattle metal trays and send a pack of sterile gauze skittering across the floor. The sound snapped down the corridor like a starter pistol. Two nurses gasped. The administrator kept scrolling her spreadsheet. Drew's face did not change. That was what unsettled them most, the absence of spectacle. No rage performance, no threats. Just a man who had already run the numbers in his head and reached the same answer every time. He looked at Evan's thumb placement one last time, then at Lena's eyes, then at Ghost. The dog's ears pinned tighter, body locked, breath shallow and ready. Years of handler training, compressed into one held second. Evan had no idea that this was the last second he would control. Then Ghost moved. He stepped once, precise and silent, and placed his body between the attorney's trembling syringe and Lena's exposed forearm, not touching either of them, just drawing a new line on the floor that everyone in that corridor understood at once. The leash slid across tile in a dry hiss. His shoulders widened. Under the tan and black saddleback coat, gone dark in the fluorescent half-light, and his head angled just enough that one amber eye held Drew, while the other fixed on Evan's hand at Lena's throat. Training sat in every inch of him. So did memory. Evan jerked at the movement without releasing pressure. "Back him off!" he snapped, voice climbing for the first time. "Back that dog off now." Drew did not raise his voice. "Needle. Down." The attorney swallowed and tried to reclaim his script. "This animal has shown imminent threat behavior in a medical corridor," he said too fast, words clipping over each other. "Under county liability protocol, immediate euthanasia is warranted and—" Ghost's growl deepened, steady as distant thunder. The attorney stopped mid-sentence. Lena's vision narrowed to sharp fragments. Evan's watch digging against her badge, the blue stripe on the crash cart wheel, a fleck of gauze clinging to blood at the corner of her mouth, the soft tremor in the pharmacist's left hand. Her lungs kept trying to pull more air than the crushed space allowed. Heat spread behind her eyes. She heard Mateo's laugh in memory for one split second and forced her fingers back onto Evan's wrist, searching tendon, leverage, anything. Her thumb found the pulse at his radial artery, hard and fast under skin that had never worried about consequence. "Say it," Evan hissed, leaning close again, jaw tight now, confidence fraying at the edges. "Say he attacked me. Say he went for me first." She shook her head once, barely a movement. His fingers cinched tighter in reply. At the med fridge, the senior administrator still stared at her tablet, scrolling line items with mechanical precision, as if she were trapped in a ritual she could not break. A nurse beside her whispered, "Call security. Back up." And the administrator answered without looking up, "He is security's backup." The sentence landed flat and ugly and true to this building's hierarchy. Two residents near the OR doors shifted their weight from foot to foot, trapped between training and fear, one of them mouthing the count under her breath as if naming it might change it. 21 witnesses, 21 chances to interrupt a felony in progress. 21 people feeling their own silence as a weight in the throat. Nobody stepped in front of Evan. Ghost did not blink. Drew took one measured step closer, boots barely audible on polished floor. He did not crowd Evan. He did not crowd Lena. He stopped at exactly the distance that gave him angle on Evan's elbow, wrist, and center of balance. His left hand remained on Ghost's collar. His right hand hung open at his side, empty, relaxed, ready. "Last warning," Drew said. Evan barked out a laugh that came out thin. "You don't threaten me in my own wing." This isn't yours. It has my name on the doors. It has cameras. That word changed the texture of the corridor. Heads lifted. Eyes flicked to the black domes at both ends of the hall, to the red recording lights everyone pretended not to see on ordinary nights. The attorney followed their gaze and, for the first time, lowered the syringe by an inch. His legal posture cracked. He looked toward the security supervisor, who did not move but did finally meet Drew's eyes. Something passed there, quick and wordless, the recognition of a man who knew exactly what he had already failed to do. Evan felt that shift and pushed harder, desperate to seize the room again. Lena's heels scraped linoleum as he lifted her higher, just enough to hurt and display. "Do you understand who I am?" he shouted, turning his voice outward now, performing for badges and cameras and cowardice. "My father chairs this foundation. My father owns this hospital. I can bury every one of you." The words echoed off tile and stainless steel. A kennel tech flinched as if struck. Lena's right hand slipped, then found purchase at the inside of Evan's wrist, where sweat made his grip less stable than he realized. She set her jaw against pain and carved one narrow pocket of air by angling her chin a fraction. Combat medicine had taught her that oxygen came in margins long before it came in relief. Count seconds. Protect airway. Stay conscious. She looked past Evan's shoulder at Drew, and in his face she saw no panic, only exact geometry. Vectors, timing, pressure points, collateral risk to dog and doctor, and everyone crowded uselessly against the walls. The calm frightened Evan more than any yell could have. The attorney tried again, weaker. "Mr. Sutherland, perhaps we pause and formalize the incident narrative before any further." "Do it now," Evan snapped. "Sign the order." He thrust his free hand toward the syringe without looking, fingers opening for it while keeping Lena pinned with the other arm. The attorney hesitated for half a beat, then leaned in, offering the barrel forward, like passing a relay baton. Ghost's ears drove forward. His body locked so hard the fur along his shoulders rippled. Drew's fingers tightened once on the collar strap. A cardiac monitor in recovery trilled in escalating intervals. Someone in scrubs whispered, "Please stop." Not to Evan, not to Drew, maybe to the whole rotten machinery that had carried this family from complaint to complaint without ever touching accountability. The security supervisor reached for his radio, thumb hovering over the transmit key, then froze when Evan's gaze slashed toward him again. Training failed in public. Power held by habit held one breath longer. Lena felt the corridor tilt, the edges of people blurred. She heard Evan's breathing, loud and uneven now, and realized his grip had shifted from control to force. Force made mistakes. Drew saw it too. "Let her go," he said, each word separate, flat, final. Evan's lip curled. "Make me." His fingers touched the syringe. Evan's knuckles blanched against her throat. The attorney's cuff caught a smear of Lena's blood near the wrist seam, and he noticed it, stared at it, and did not wipe it away, as if the stain itself had become a liability exhibit he could not argue around. At the edges of the scene, the bystanders rearranged themselves by inches, each small movement a confession. One resident stepping behind another, an orderly turning his badge inward. The administrator finally lowering her tablet, but still not lowering her chin enough to meet Lena's eyes. Ghost breathed once through his nose, short and sharp. Drew felt the breath travel down the leash like current. In that held second, the story had already become bigger than a single chokehold and a single syringe. It had become records and reports, chain of custody, toxicology, camera timestamps, badge logs, security access points, handwritten notes on controlled substances, and every prior complaint that had vanished when the Sutherland name entered the room. It had become all the buried paperwork, that thought it would stay buried. It had become a hallway full of witnesses who would soon learn that silence also generated a trail. The pharmacist, still clutching her clipboard, took one shaky step toward the supply alcove phone, then another. She did not call yet, but she moved. A nurse beside her saw it and shifted too, eyes on Drew, waiting for a signal she could live with. The security supervisor's thumb finally depressed the radio key halfway, stopped, then committed fully. Static cracked. No words yet, only the sound of a channel opening after too many nights closed. Evan noticed none of it. He was staring at Drew with the furious disbelief of a man encountering a boundary for the first time. "You think you can walk in here and rewrite policy?" he said. Drew answered without inflection. "Policy doesn't crush throats." The attorney tried to recover command through paperwork. "Dr. Ortiz is medically distressed and therefore not competent to issue statements," he said, forcing legal cadence back into his voice. "In the interest of safety and liability, we proceed under emergency destruction authority and complete incident documentation after you kill evidence," Drew said. The sentence cut clean. The attorney's face drained a shade. His eyes flicked toward the syringe in Evan's hand, then to the med fridge, then to Ghost, then back to Drew, calculations visibly failing to settle. He had walked into this corridor expecting theater, a rich client, a frightened staff, a controlled narrative by sunrise. He had not budgeted for a handler who understood both force and paperwork, both violence and evidence, and knew exactly how fast lies unraveled when timestamps started talking to each other. Lena forced one shallow breath, then another. Her fingertips tingled with oxygen debt. She focused on the texture of Evan's sleeve seam under her thumb to keep from slipping under. Stay here. Stay present. Mateo needed inhalers. Mateo needed breakfast before school. Mateo needed her voice steady when night storms made him scared of the dark. She would not vanish in this corridor because a donor's son wanted a dead dog and a signed lie. A nurse finally spoke, voice shaking but audible. "Dr. Ortiz needs airway support now." Evan snapped his head toward her. "You speak when I tell you." The nurse flinched, then held her ground. It wasn't heroism yet. It was the first crack. Drew did not look away from Evan. "This is the last second," he said. Ghost shifted his weight forward 1 inch. No more. Waiting on command, he trusted more than instinct. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that fluorescent corridor, you need to know who Lena Ortiz was before a hand closed on her throat, who Drew Foster had been before sleep left him, and why Ghost recognized lethal intent faster than anyone wearing a hospital badge. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight, because this hallway had 21 badges and still needed one man and one war dog to choose courage when institutions chose silence. If you believe veterans and working animals deserve loyalty in return for what they have carried, subscribe and stay with the story to the end. What happened in this corridor before dawn did not just stop an assault. It took apart a family's immunity piece by piece where everyone could see it. Lena Ortiz had been 32 the night Evan Sutherland's hand closed on her throat, but her day had started 19 hours earlier at a kitchen table, covered in second-grade spelling words, insurance forms, and a nebulizer mask she cleaned with white vinegar because replacement parts cost more than they should have. She lived in a 2-bedroom duplex 10 minutes from the hospital if the traffic lights favored her, 12 if they did not, and she measured that distance the way combat medics measured evacuation windows. Not in miles, in survivability. Mateo slept in the room with glow-in-the-dark planets on the ceiling, and one cracked baseboard heater that clicked all winter. He was 8, narrow-shouldered, serious about dinosaurs, and old enough to set up his own spacer device for his inhaler, but still young enough to leave one sock in every room he entered. On school mornings, Lena packed his lunch while coffee burned on the stove, then tucked his rescue inhaler into the outer pocket of his backpack and checked that it was the blue one, the only brand that stopped the midnight attacks before panic set in. She checked it twice, always twice. By the second week of October, she had stopped buying anything that was not measured against Mateo's breathing. Store-brand cereal replaced the kind with cartoon mascots. Her phone screen stayed cracked. The muffler on her 10-year-old sedan rattled through every red light in Cedar Falls because fixing it could wait, and pulmonary medication could not. She worked nights at Sutherland Memorial Veterinary Hospital because overnight differential pay added $4 an hour, and she picked up extra weekend triage because Guardianship Court had asked for stable housing records, school attendance, and proof she could meet all ongoing medical needs. She brought binders to that hearing, tabbed and color-coded, and spoke in the calm, plain cadence of someone used to giving casualty reports under pressure. When the judge asked why she wanted legal guardianship instead of temporary custody, Lena answered, "He already lost one parent. He doesn't need another temporary arrangement." Nobody in that courtroom argued with her after that. Before veterinary school, she had been Army, 68 whiskey, forward deployed medic attached to units that moved fast and got hurt faster. She had treated blast injuries in Kandahar dust and heat exhaustion in motor pools where asphalt shimmered. She learned to work by touch when lights failed, by sound when radios overloaded, by priorities when everything mattered and time allowed only one intervention at a time. Airway first, bleeding second. Shock always waiting. The habit stayed even after discharge, even after board exams and civilian credentials and polished hospital corridors with pastel wall paint, meant to calm pet owners at their worst hour. She still sat facing doors in break rooms. She still noted exits by reflex. She still woke when silence went too still. 3 days after her first overnight shift at Sutherland Memorial, a senior surgeon found her in the supply alcove, relabeling crash cart drawers by expiration date, and told her she was overqualified for this place. Lena had smiled once and said, "Overqualified is just another word for useful at 3 a.m. He laughed. She did not. At that hour, she was usually placing chest drains in Great Danes hit by trucks, stabilizing septic cats from backyard breeders, or guiding exhausted families through the difference between treatment and suffering in a voice that never rushed them. She was direct, not cold, precise, not distant. People trusted her because she never sold false hope and never withheld real options. She carried one photo behind her badge. Mateo at a school carnival, missing front tooth, one hand around a blue ribbon he won at beanbag toss, the other around that same inhaler like he knew it mattered. When long shifts blurred into each other, she touched the badge unconsciously before hard cases. A small ritual that reset the equation. Keep the patient alive. Keep the paycheck steady. Get home before the school bus. On Tuesdays, Mrs. Klein from next door watched Mateo after school until Lena woke. On Thursdays, Lena paid a high school senior from the block to walk him the 2 streets to the library program when Mrs. Klein had dialysis. Every arrangement lived on a dry erase board by the fridge. Pickup times, co-pay dates, refill reminders, emergency contacts. Beneath all of it, written in black marker and underlined twice. No gaps. Her sister Marisol had died 18 months earlier after a winter highway pileup that did not look dramatic on paper and still emptied a house in one afternoon. Lena got the call in a treatment bay while suturing a laceration on a retired police K-9. She finished the stitches before she sat down. She had signed too many next-of-kin forms in uniform to mistake the tone of that phone call for anything else. The grief came in practical pieces first: school transfer forms, probate filings, child services interviews, an argument with an insurance company over oxygen equipment coding. Tears came later, usually while folding Mateo's laundry after he had gone to sleep. Irreplaceable was not a sentimental word in Lena's world. It was logistical truth. By early November, the overnight staff knew she took the admissions desk for 10 minutes at 4:40 a.m., so the receptionist could pump breast milk in private. They knew she stocked pediatric masks in the family consult room, even though this was a veterinary hospital, because anxious children came with injured pets, and breathing slowed when they saw adults prepare. They knew she never left controlled substance logs incomplete, even at shift end, even when her eyes burned from fatigue. Once, at 2:13 a.m., she caught a decimal error in a ketamine entry, corrected it, and had the night pharmacist initial the amendment. Small things. Critical things. The kind that keep systems honest when people do not. She was that kind of doctor. Evan Sutherland was 26 and had never needed to be that kind of anything. He moved through Sutherland Memorial like the building had been poured around him, with expensive sunglasses still on at 3 a.m., leather jacket over tailored black knit, designer sneakers in sterile zones despite posted rules, and the lazy confidence of a man who had never been told to wait his turn. The Sutherland name arched in brushed steel above the trauma wing doors, engraved on donor plaques from lobby to oncology consults, embossed on gala invitations that funded half the county's board campaigns. His father, Charles Sutherland, chaired the hospital foundation and sat on 3 committees that reviewed executive appointments. His mother chaired the Arts Council. Their money bought new wings, press releases, and silence. The first complaint Lena heard about Evan came during a break-room whisper 2 weeks into her contract. A kennel tech named Riley said he had grabbed a vet resident by the upper arm outside imaging, and laughed when she told him to let go. Security footage existed for exactly 6 hours before server migration erased that camera segment only. Human Resources opened an inquiry, documented no corroboration, and closed it the same day. Riley was transferred to day shift for workflow optimization, which everyone understood as punishment for speaking in writing. No one said his last name out loud after that without lowering their voice. By Thanksgiving week, there were 4 closed reports in internal gossip and none in formal records. A billing clerk received late-night messages from an unknown number after refusing to alter an invoice tied to one of Evan's friends. She reported harassment, then withdrew her statement after a sheriff's deputy told her she could face defamation exposure if she could not prove intent. An intern filed an incident note about Evan entering a controlled drug prep area without badge authorization. Compliance marked it user error and retrained the intern on proper access etiquette. The deputy who delivered that warning had coached high school football with Charles Sutherland for 9 years. In Cedar Falls, networks were tighter than policy manuals. 3 days passed before Lena saw Evan test the system in person. He walked into the surgical corridor with 2 friends and a phone held chest high, filming as if on a tour, while a post-op Shepherd mix cried in recovery. Lena intercepted him at the red line marking restricted access and said, "Sterile area. Phone's away." Evans smiled without warmth and stepped across the line anyway. When she repeated the instruction, he angled his camera toward her badge and said, "Do you know who signs your payroll?" She answered, "The same person who signs infection control audits." He laughed, backed out, and uploaded the clip with a caption about power-tripping staff. By morning, the post had thousands of local views and comments, calling her unstable, anti-client, ungrateful. Hospital PR issued no correction. Lena filed the proper report anyway. Incident form, timestamp, witness names, location, requested review of access logs. She sent a parallel email to compliance and copied security. Outcome arrived 48 hours later. No actionable violation, counseling not indicated, staff reminded to practice de-escalation with high-profile donors. The memo used neutral language so polished it could have reflected faces. The message underneath was plain. Endure it. She did not endure quietly. She documented everything. By mid-December, her private notebook held dates, hallway cameras, badge numbers, snippets of exact phrasing, and the names of people who looked away. She kept copies of controlled substance discrepancy alerts in a sealed envelope at home, not because she imagined heroics, but because military training had taught her that records disappeared fastest when they mattered most. Chain of custody began with ordinary habits: date, time, initials, signatures. She built a paper spine for a place that preferred soft tissue. Evan kept escalating because escalation had worked his entire life. He cornered junior staff near supply rooms and framed intimidation as jokes. He leaned too close. He touched shoulders like ownership. He said things like, "You don't want to make this complicated, and my father built this wing," and I watched people fold around the sentence. One resident resigned in January after a night shift, where Evan blocked the elevator doors with his arm until she agreed to have drinks with him. She gave notice, citing family reasons. Her exit interview contained no reference to him because the form was not anonymous, and the interviewer reported to the same executive office that organized the Sutherland Gala. Systemic protection did not look like one dramatic conspiracy. It looked like 10 small edits, each defensible alone, devastating in aggregate. The attorney, Martin Kell, entered the pattern in late winter. He began appearing on overnight calls framed as risk advisement, carrying a charcoal suit like armor and speaking in clauses that turned harm into liability exposure for anyone harmed. He trained managers to say threat posture and adverse encounter. He reminded staff that donor relationships sustained charity care. He said this while standing beneath a portrait of Charles Sutherland, presenting a check large enough to rename departments. When people asked whether Evan would face conduct restrictions, Kell answered with process language that never reached consequences. Lena attended one of those meetings, arms folded, jaw set, fatigue hidden behind clinical calm. She asked why a non-employee donor family member retained unrestricted after-hours access to controlled medication zones. Kell smiled thinly and said, "Your role is medicine, Dr. Ortiz. Governance is handled above your pay grade." She wrote his sentence down verbatim after the meeting and placed that note in the same sealed envelope at home. By the first week of March, the hospital felt like a structure held together by disinfectant and denial. The night before the corridor assault, Lena had completed a controlled substance reconciliation at 2:41 a.m. and noted a ketamine count discrepancy of 1 vial from an anesthesia cart outside procedure room 2. She rechecked signatures. One entry had overwritten initials inconsistent with standard hand pattern, the looped K to deliberate, the timestamp corrected without countersignature. She photographed the log under Policy Authority, filed an urgent discrepancy report, and notified the overnight pharmacist, who confirmed the mismatch and sent an internal alert. At 3:02 a.m., compliance auto-acknowledged receipt. At 3:05 a.m., Evan Sutherland badged into the restricted corridor using a temporary access credential issued under executive override. The alert chain had existed. The outcomes had not. That was the architecture of his untouchability. Family name on the doors, foundation money in board coffers, a sheriff's office that treated complaints as social errors, legal counsel that translated violence into paperwork, administrators who mistook risk containment for ethics, and a workforce trained by repetition to look down when the wrong man stepped too close. Evan believed himself immune because every layer had taught him he was. He would carry that belief into the corridor at 3:07 a.m., into Lena's airway, into Ghost's line of sight, and into the first moment of his life, when the system he owned began recording him instead. At the far end of that corridor, Drew Foster held Ghost's collar with 2 fingers under the strap, and he looked like a man who had gone still on purpose because motion had once cost him someone he loved. He had not been born calm. He had been trained into it, deployment by deployment, casualty by casualty, until economy of movement became the only language his body trusted. 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders from years under load, he carried his weight like a pack frame, even when his hands were empty. Short, dark hair, gray already touching the temples. Old scar crossing the jaw from a shattered windshield on a convoy transfer outside Aden. Knuckles ridged from rope burns, door charges, and 1 blast door in Yemen that had not opened on time. In NWU Type 3 camouflage, he looked less like a visitor in that veterinary hospital than a final audit. 3 years earlier, his team had flown into Yemen under no moon, rotors chopping dust into a brown wall that swallowed depth and distance. The target compound sat in a dry river cut outside Al-Mahra, concrete shell, 2 outbuildings, 1 known access lane, and 3 likely kill funnels. Mason Reed had been on Drew's left that night. JTAC qualified, quick with maps and terrible coffee, the kind of teammate who could thread a joke through a radio check without missing a coordinate. They breached clean, cleared clean, and took contact on exfil from a rooftop shooter none of the thermal feeds had caught. Mason went down at the second gate with a chest wound that sounded small and looked manageable in white light. It wasn't. Drew packed the wound, sealed, decompressed, called medevac. 9-line sent, confirmed, resent when comms skipped. The bird delayed for weather and fuel and 1 layer of command indecision that had no name in after-action language, but lived in every second between request and arrival. Mason stayed awake for 19 minutes while Drew worked his airway and pulse and told him lies men tell each other in those moments. "You're good. Stay with me. Birds inbound." Mason watched the rotor wash of a helicopter that had not reached them yet and whispered, "Don't let him go alone," meaning Ghost, because Ghost had already tried to climb into his lap once, and Drew had pulled him back by the harness handle so the medic could work. By the time the medevac skids hit dirt, Mason's pulse had gone thin enough to count with faith instead of fingers. He died in the aircraft before sunrise. Drew signed the report at 11:42 local, hands washed twice and still smelling like copper and antiseptic. The official language read, "Delayed extraction under adverse conditions." The unofficial language was simpler. He had asked for help. Help came late. Mason Reed did not come home. The funeral happened under hard winter light in Virginia with folded flags, polished shoes, and a silence too clean to hold what actually happened on that rooftop. Ghost stood beside Drew through the whole ceremony, tan and black coat, turning gold when sunlight broke, and dark as iron when clouds closed again. At graveside, Ghost pressed his muzzle to the flag case once, then leaned his shoulder into Drew's thigh and stayed there until every car left. Drew had not cried in public since Bud S. He did that day, one hand in the fur at Ghost's neck, the other clenched so tight his nails cut his palm. Sleep left him after Yemen and did not come back in any reliable form. He learned to rest in 90-minute fragments with the television running low because pure silence made his pulse climb like incoming fire. Refrigerator hum, traffic 6 blocks away, furnace kicking on, those were manageable. No sound at all felt like a held breath before impact. By the 3rd month after the extraction, he had mapped his apartment in night routes, bed to front door to kitchen, kitchen to window line back to Ghost's mat. He checked latches twice and stove knobs twice, and the hall mirror for movement that was never there. Hypervigilance did not announce itself as fear. It presented as procedure. Ghost became the only procedure that softened him. When the dog slept, Drew could close his eyes for 30 minutes at a time and trust the room. When Ghost's breathing changed, Drew woke before he understood why. They had lived through too much together for pretense. Ghost had seen Drew shake awake from rotor dreams and had climbed onto the edge of the couch, one heavy paw over Drew's forearm until the tremor passed. Drew had seen Ghost freeze at the sound of a dropped metal tray and then recover when he heard Drew's voice. Neither one judged the other's scars. They simply adjusted around them. Retirement papers did not fix any of it. They only changed where the damage lived. The hardest fight of Drew's post-service life was not in a doorway under fire. It was in offices with fluorescent lighting, toner smell, and policy binders thick enough to bury accountability. Ghost had reached disposition age with service injuries on file, and the first recommendation from the center board listed transfer to auction pipeline under restricted working status. The words read neutral. The effect was abandonment with paperwork attached. Drew filed immediate adoption petition. Denied for housing and medical suitability review. He appealed. Denied for processing backlog. He filed again with letters from 2 unit surgeons, one former command master chief, and a civilian orthopedic specialist who documented Ghost's left hip degeneration from Kandahar shrapnel. 14 months of forms, 14 months of hearings, callbacks, and signatures that stalled at one desk, then another. He drove to Fort Saylor Disposition Center every Thursday he was stateside, sat in molded plastic chairs under humming lights, and waited while clerks moved folders from inbox to outbox like time did not matter to anyone with fur and a service number. He brought Ghost-approved food when he was allowed contact. On weeks he was denied kennel access for administrative reasons. He sat in the parking lot and watched the secure gate, jaw tight, hands still, telling himself discipline was not surrender. One rainy morning in month 9, a captain he did not know read the file, looked at the line item marked 5 deployments, and asked why Drew was emotionally invested beyond standard handler attachment. Drew answered without heat. Because he came home with me from Yemen and my teammate didn't. The captain stared at him for a long second, then signed the next review step. Not approval, just movement. In bureaucracy, movement counted. On month 14, approval came through at 4:17 p.m. by email with a subject line that treated the decision as routine disposition adjustment. Drew printed that page, folded it into his wallet, and carried it like a relic. Ghost walked out of the center with a slight hitch in the left rear leg and the bearing of an old professional. 9 years old, German Shepherd, 5 deployments, 23 lives credited in after-action reports, where his alerts had preceded blasts, ambushes, and one booby-trapped stairwell that would have taken an entire element. Specificity mattered because forgetting began where language got vague. He had not been a good dog. He had been a decorated MWD whose nose, discipline, and courage had altered casualty math in theaters where seconds decided families. Kandahar was where the hip injury happened. Compound breach, north wall, winter wind cutting through broken concrete. Ghost took point after a thermal anomaly near the secondary door, flagged pressure change and explosive scent profile, and held position despite incoming rounds. The first blast hit low and lateral when a secondary device cooked off in debris. Shrapnel tore through the left hip and flank, hot fragment path that missed the femoral by inches and still left him down hard with the sound Drew heard in sleep for a year. Ghost tried to stand 3 times on that leg before the medic reached him. On the third attempt, he braced on his front paws and looked straight at Drew, waiting for command, blood dark on tan fur, ears still working the air. They evacuated him under suppressive fire. 28 stitches, 2 drains, months of rehab. He returned to duty with a permanent weather ache and a gait that stiffened in cold mornings. He also returned with his alert sequence intact, ears rotating forward, body locking, growl low and steady when threat crossed from theory to present fact. In training halls and real corridors, that sequence became Drew's second heartbeat. Ghost had alerted on buried pressure plates, volatile chemical trace, and men whose hands moved wrong when they thought no one was watching. In Yemen, he once froze at a generator housing while local contractors argued it was clean. EOD found packed explosives wired to remote detonation on a delay. 7 men from Drew's element sent ghost stake scraps that night and called him chief behind closed doors. After retirement, people saw the limp before they saw the history. At civilian clinics, receptionists asked if he was still trainable. At one county event, a donor with polished loafers asked whether old military dogs were safe around families, as if service had made him suspect. Drew learned to answer with silence or numbers. 5 deployments, 23 credited saves, 1 Purple Heart equivalent, commendation for military working animals. Left hip shrapnel, Kandahar. Not theory. Record. Still, there were days when he felt the world reducing Ghost to liability language and paperwork categories because reverence required memory, and memory was work. Lena Ortiz had been one of the few civilians who never needed the speech. The first week Drew brought Ghost into Sutherland Memorial for winter pain management. She knelt to eye level at a respectful distance, let Ghost scent her glove, then checked the old scar tissue with hands as steady as field medicine. "He compensates when he turns right," she had said. "Not weakness, pattern." Ghost leaned into her palm once and accepted the exam without restraint. Afterward, Lena printed 2 care plans, one for ideal budgets and one for real budgets, and highlighted where efficacy held even when cost forced substitutions. She never called him retired like that meant finished. She called him active in a different mission profile. By late January, Ghost knew the overnight corridor smells at Sutherland Memorial. Disinfectant, wet fur, printer toner, coffee gone bitter in break rooms. He knew which techs moved with calm hands and which ones carried fear and sharp motions. He knew Lena's voice cadence when a case was urgent but recoverable, and the lower cadence when families needed truth without cruelty. Most of all, he knew Drew's pulse through the leash. On quiet nights, he slept with one ear half cocked toward any change in Lena's breathing when she worked near them. Not protective in a theatrical way. Professional. Alert, anchored to relationship. That was why the moment at 3:07 a.m. mattered with surgical precision. Ghost had not reacted to noise. Hospitals were full of noise. He had not reacted to proximity. Crowded hallways were ordinary. He had reacted to lethal intent layered over chemical threat, to a hand crushing an airway while a syringe hovered over his vein, to stress hormones and body mechanics that matched every pattern his training had taught him to mark. In that corridor, his ears had pinned forward, body had gone rigid, and a growl had rolled from his chest because he recognized the threshold no one wearing a badge seemed willing to name. Drew recognized it with him. He stood there in NWU Type 3, hand steady on the collar, old grief and old discipline fused into one narrow line of control, and everything in his history converged on that held second. Mason dying in delayed rotor wash, 14 months fighting forms to bring Ghost home, nights measured by breathing, and a veteran dog who had already saved 23 lives, refusing to let a 24th be taken under fluorescent lights and donor immunity. Ghost was not the threat in that hallway. He was the warning the hallway had ignored until it ran out of room. Ghost's chest expanded, then settled, and Drew felt the vibration of that contained growl through leather, through scar tissue in his own palm, through the old promise he had made at a graveside, and kept every day since. Evan still had Lena by the throat. Her heels brushed tile with a dry squeak each time his grip shifted, a sound so small it might have disappeared if the corridor had not gone so quiet. Mateo's photo badge tapped Evan's watch again. Plastic against metal, child's grin against donor steel, and Lena's fingers kept working for leverage in the narrow gap between tendon and arrogance. She did not waste movement. She fought for millimeters because she knew millimeters kept people alive long enough for help to matter. The smell in the hall thickened. Disinfectant, adrenaline sweat, the sharp medicinal sting from the uncapped syringe Martin Kell still held too close to Ghost's leg. 21 badges watched. One resident's mouth moved around silent counting. One orderly stared at the floor drain as if it offered instructions. The administrator in the cream blazer lowered her tablet at last, but her eyes kept sliding toward the Sutherland name, etched in brushed steel over the trauma doors, as if lettering still outranked oxygen. No one had touched Evan yet. Drew saw all of it in one scan. He marked the red camera lights at both ends of the corridor, the half-open crash cart drawer, the attorney's blood smear near his cuff seam, the security supervisor's thumb white against a radio mic he had finally keyed. He marked Lena's pupils, still responsive. He marked her airway collapse pattern and the loss of color around her mouth. He marked Ghost's stance, weight forward but held, waiting on command instead of instinct. By 3:08 a.m., every person in that hallway understood this was no longer a donor tantrum. Evan didn't. He was still living in the old script, still breathing hard through flared nostrils like outrage was authority. "You don't set terms here," he said to Drew. "You wear camouflage and think that scares me? My father chairs the foundation. The sheriff answers our calls. This corridor runs on our money." Drew kept his eyes on the hand at Lena's throat. "Release." One word, flat as a sealed hatch. Evan smiled with too many teeth and tightened again. Lena's breath broke into a ragged choke, and pain flashed across her face before she forced it back under discipline. She had done this in dust storms and aid tents, Drew thought. She had kept strangers alive on less air than this. She would not get erased in a funded hallway because a man in designer sneakers needed an audience. Martin Kell found his voice and tried to climb back into legal language. "Mr. Sutherland is acting under perceived threat from an aggressive military animal," he said, speaking to the room, to the cameras, to future transcripts. "Emergency neutralization is indicated." Dr. Ortiz's condition prevents reliable testimony in this moment. Lena turned her head a fraction against Evan's forearm and forced out a whisper that scraped raw. "That's a lie." Kell flinched as if the words had struck him. Ghost's ears drove forward, his body locked. The growl rolled lower. Drew's hand tightened on the collar strap and stayed there. No drama. No raised voice, just total control at the edge of force. The same control that had kept men alive in compounds where one bad second became a folded flag. A nurse from trauma stepped forward 2 paces, shaking. "She needs airway support now," she said, louder this time. Evan snapped his head toward her without releasing Lena. "Back up." She did not move back. The security supervisor finally spoke into his radio. "Code Gray, surgical corridor, B, repeat, Code Gray, active assault in progress, need law enforcement and external oversight." External oversight. The phrase landed like a door opening. Evan heard it and blinked, confused for the first time. "Cancel that," he barked. "You report to us." The supervisor kept his gaze on Drew, not Evan. "Not tonight." That was the second crack. The pharmacist, who had been praying, finished dialing from the supply alcove wall phone. Her voice shook, but each detail came out exact. Location, names, controlled substance involved, physician assaulted, witnesses present, cameras live. She hung up and held the receiver for a second longer, breathing through her mouth like she expected to be punished for doing her job. No one stopped her. Lena's knees buckled and recovered. She was fading at the edges now, but she stayed in the fight. Right thumb grinding into Evan's radial notch, left hand peeling at his thumb with patient, brutal persistence. Drew saw her angle her chin again for a tiny channel of air and thought of all the checklists she had run at this hospital while people above her paid invoices and buried complaints. She was still working the problem. Evan saw the room changing around him and tried to seize it back with volume. "Look at me," he shouted at the witnesses. "Every one of you has a contract tied to this family. You cross me, you're done." Nobody answered. Even Kell didn't echo him this time. The corridor monitor over recovery kept chiming in repetitive high tones until a resident finally reached in through the doorway and silenced it. The sudden quiet made Ghost's growl feel louder, even though it never rose. It sat in the bones of the hallway, a warning no policy could redact. Drew shifted 1 step left, opening his angle on Evan's elbow. His right hand rose, empty, palm visible. "Needle down," he said to Kell. Kell looked at Evan, then at the syringe, then at the camera dome, and lowered it to chest height. "On the cart," Drew said. Kell hesitated. Ghost rose. Not a lunge, not a strike. He lifted to full height on locked forelegs, 85 pounds of trained pressure, an old pain, tan and black coat, dark as iron under fluorescent light, eyes fixed on the hand that held the drug. The movement was controlled enough to be legal and clear enough to be terrifying. Every person in that hall felt the line move under their feet. Kell set the syringe on the crash cart. No one missed the relief in the sound of plastic touching steel. Evan swore under his breath and reached with his free hand, trying to snatch it back. Drew cut across his wrist with a short redirect, not enough to injure, just enough to break the reach. Evan recoiled, stunned that someone had touched him without permission. His grip on Lena loosened for half a second. She dropped one heel to the floor, coughed, and dragged in a slicing breath that sounded like torn paper but was still breath. "Don't," Drew said. Evan stared at him, chest heaving. "You just put your hands on me. You're assaulting a doctor. You're dead in this town." Drew didn't blink. "Let her go." 3 words had become 3 rounds chambered with certainty. For the first time, Evan actually looked at Drew instead of through him. He took in the gray at the temples, the old scar on the jaw, the hands that never shook, the posture of someone who had spent years doing hard things in silence and had no need to advertise any of it. Then his gaze dropped to Ghost and found no chaos there either, only discipline held so tight it felt colder than rage. He had spent his life mistaking noise for power. Now he was looking at power without noise. Lena's body sagged again. Drew saw the micro-tremor at her eyelids and heard the wet pull in her airway. Time was gone. He shifted weight to his rear foot and set his hip line for entry, calculating wall distance, cart edge, Evan's center of gravity, Lena's fall path, Ghost's lane, bystander radius, everything aligned in a single geometry he had practiced for years and hoped not to use in civilian light. Last chance, he said. Evan's answer came automatic, inherited, almost childish in its certainty. My father owns this place. He should have heard how thin it sounded now. The administrator in cream finally spoke, voice small. Evan, release her. This is being recorded. He whipped his head toward her. You shut up. She flinched and then quietly reached to lock her tablet screen. It was a tiny act, but it was the first time all night she chose the corridor over the spreadsheet. Lena coughed again, harsher, and managed one torn sentence toward Drew. Ketamine. Cart log. He changed initials. The words hit Kell like ice water. Doctor, do not speculate, he snapped too fast. I documented it, she whispered. Drew watched Kell's face fold inward at the edges. There it was. Not just violence, but preloaded narrative. Not just panic, but planning. Missing vial, forged entry, emergency euthanasia claim, ready before the needle even touched Ghost. Ghost had alerted on the truth before anyone else admitted there was one. Evan still had not let go. His thumb dug back in, desperate now, less controlled, more crushing. The corridor recoiled as one body. A nurse cried out. The resident who had silenced the monitors stepped forward like she might intervene physically, then stopped when Drew moved first. He entered on a diagonal, fast and compact, left forearm pinning Evan's attacking arm at the wrist, while his right hand captured the elbow and turned the joint offline. At the same instant, he drove his shoulder between Evan and Lena, taking her weight as grip failed. Evan lost balance against the crash cart, shoes sliding on the smear of dropped saline, and Drew redirected momentum down, rotating him to the floor in one controlled arc. The impact sounded like a heavy bag dropped on reinforced tile. No strike followed, no extra force, just containment. Ghost stepped in and held position over the fallen syringe and 2 feet from Evan's free hand, head low, eyes hard, growl steady and warning. Drew knelt on Evan's shoulder line, wrists pinned, pressure exact. Lena stumbled into the nurse who had stepped forward earlier. Together they lowered to one knee against the wall, while the anesthetist rushed in with oxygen tubing and a portable mask. Cuffs, Drew said. The security supervisor was already moving. Evan struggled once, then again, and froze when Ghost's growl dipped another register. He looked up at Drew from the floor, face drained, and finally saw it fully. This was a man who had calculated endings for a living, and this ending did not include donor immunity, edited footage, or a lawyer's script. In Drew's eyes, Evan met the first consequence he had ever believed would never come. Evan tried to wrench his pinned arm free, twisted toward the crash cart, and reached for the syringe one more time. Ghost hit the movement before anyone else processed it. One clean forward step. One controlled bite and hold on Evan's sleeve and forearm. Pressure exact, no shake, no frenzy. Evan shouted, more shock than pain, and froze when Drew's voice cut through the corridor. Out! Ghost released instantly and reset 2 feet back, head low, eyes locked. growl steady as a warning line painted in sound. That single second became the sentence everyone would argue about for the next 3 hours. The security supervisor snapped cuffs on Evan, forced his shoulders flat, and kept his weight centered as he said, "You're being detained and held for county deputies. Stay still. Do not touch anything." Martin Kell lunged toward the cart, maybe to recover the syringe, maybe to hide it, and the trauma nurse, who had stepped forward first, put her body in his lane and said, "Don't touch evidence." He stopped, breathing hard through his nose, his charcoal cuff still marked with Lena's blood, where he had brushed her during the choke hold. By 3:14 a.m., 2 county deputies entered the hall, took one look at Evan on the floor, and hesitated when they recognized him. Evan lifted his chin from tile and barked, "Uncuff me. Call my father." The older deputy looked at the Sutherland name over the doors, then at the live red camera lights, then at Lena on oxygen with finger bruises rising across her throat. He didn't move toward the cuffs. The radio on his shoulder cracked with a new voice from dispatch. "State Diversion Unit en route. County prosecutor notified. Preserve scene." Evan laughed once, brittle. "You don't bring state for this." Deputy answered without heat. "Missing ketamine from a controlled cart. Assault on medical staff. Active evidence. Tampering allegation on a recorded corridor. We do tonight." He stepped in, took formal custody from hospital security, and read Evan his rights from a printed card while his partner's body cam ran. Kell tried to recover the room with legal cadence. "My client acted under immediate threat from an aggressive dog. Emergency Euthanasia Authority." "Save it," the deputy said. "You can give that statement on record." Lena pulled off the oxygen mask long enough to speak through a ravaged throat. "Syringe lot number first. Chain of custody now." The pharmacist was already at the cart, hands shaking but precise. She read the lot number aloud twice, while a resident wrote it into the incident sheet, and the deputy's body cam captured both voices. The syringe went into an evidence tube. The gauze pack that had skittered across the floor was bagged because it held a partial shoe print in diluted blood. Kell's cuff was swabbed, where the stain sat dark near the seam. Evan's right cuff was swabbed too, and the cotton tip flashed faint pink under field reagent before it was sealed for full tox. At 3:29 a.m., the compliance director appeared in a wrinkled clothes and tried to steer everyone toward a conference room to reduce disruption. Drew didn't answer. Lena did. "Scene stays intact," she whispered. "No internal handling." The state investigator, who arrived 2 minutes later, backed her. She was compact, gray-haired, and carried 2 evidence cases and no patience for donor hierarchies. She walked the corridor once, took in the plaque, the camera domes, the crash cart, the faces, and said, "Anyone who touches anything without my authorization will be included in obstruction paperwork." No one tested that rule. The senior administrator in the cream blazer stood against the med fridge with her tablet hugged to her chest like a shield. For 10 minutes she said nothing. Then she looked at Lena's throat and Drew's uniform and Ghost's stillness and stepped forward. "I got a text at 3:06, she said, voice thin, "from Charles Sutherland. He said, 'Keep this internal and protect the family.'" She unlocked the tablet with both thumbs, opened the message thread, and handed it to the investigator without looking up again. That was the third crack, and the biggest. The intern who had stared at the eyewash station gave a statement and cried through half of it. The resident who had started to pull her phone from her pocket admitted she had put it back because she was scared, then signed that she had seen Evan's thumb compress Lena's airway and had heard him order a false narrative. The anesthetist confirmed timestamps against monitor alarms. The nurse who had whispered "don't" in the opening minutes said she had recognized Kell from prior suppression meetings and had stayed silent because her sister worked in county payroll. She said it like confession, not excuse. One person never spoke. The orderly who had turned his badge inward asked for counsel and made no statement that night. The record noted his refusal. It stayed that way. At 4:11 a.m., State IT mirrored both corridor camera feeds to encrypted storage in front of 3 witnesses, including the security supervisor who had finally keyed his radio. The server migration explanation that had erased earlier complaints died on the spot when logs showed this footage had recorded continuously. No dropouts, no corruption, no gaps. Kell asked to make a private call. He was allowed one on speaker within earshot. "I need counsel," he said. "Bar exposure likely." By 4:26 a.m., Evan had stopped talking about ownership and started asking for water. The bite issue came under white light in exam room 4, converted to a forensic station before dawn. The independent veterinary trauma specialist arrived from the county emergency network, reviewed the wound photos, measured arc distance, depth, and tissue pattern, then reviewed the corridor footage frame by frame with the state investigator, Drew, and Lena present. "Single controlled hold," she said, tapping the screen where Evan's free hand shot toward the syringe as he was being restrained. "Initiated after subject attempted to regain access to a loaded needle and while assault was ongoing. No tear pattern from shaking. Immediate release on handler command. This is defensive intervention, not predatory attack." Kell closed his eyes for one beat. The toxicology prelim came back at 5:02 a.m. on Evan's cuff and thumb webbing. Ketamine residue, consistent with direct handling of injectable solution. The controlled drug log Lena had photographed showed overwritten initials. The pharmacist identified the pen stroke mismatch and confirmed no countersignature. Compliance auto-acknowledged Lena's discrepancy alert at 3:02 a.m., 5 minutes before Evan badged into the restricted zone on executive override. Badge logs put him there. Text put his father in play. Camera placed the attorney at the syringe before any claimed canine aggression. Layer by layer, the shield turned into an exhibit list. When Charles Sutherland arrived at 5:19 a.m., coat over silk pajamas, he came in loud and left quiet. He demanded release, threatened donor withdrawal, named board members like weapons. The county prosecutor met him in the corridor, held up printed stills from the recording, and said, "Your name over that door is now contextual evidence, not mitigating status. Do not contact witnesses." He looked at the plaque then, maybe for the first time, as a liability. He did not answer. At sunrise, maintenance workers under investigators' supervision removed the temporary donor signage from the pediatric annex entrance, pending fraud and governance review. Metal letters came off with a pry tool and a sound like old nails letting go. Staff watched from the nurse station in complete silence. No one looked away this time. The hallway emptied by 6:40 a.m., leaving disinfectant, stale coffee, and the aftershock that follows truth when it finally gets documented. Lena sat on a supply crate wrapped in a warmed blanket, voice almost gone, bruising dark at her throat. Mateo's photo badge resting flat against her chest, instead of swinging like a metronome. Drew stood 2 steps away while Ghost leaned against his leg, left hip stiff from the long hold, but eyes clear. Lena looked at Ghost first. "He saved me," she whispered. Drew shook his head once. "You held." She gave a dry, tired half-laugh that hurt her throat. "We both did." Her phone buzzed. Mrs. Klein on video, kitchen light behind her, Mateo at the edge of frame with his backpack on, and his inhaler clipped where Lena always clipped it. The boy's eyes widened when he saw the blanket and the oxygen bruised tape at Lena's neck. Aunt Lena? I'm okay, Bug, she said, voice rough but steady. I'm safe. Mateo nodded too many times, then leaned closer to the screen. Is Ghost there? Drew crouched so the camera caught the dog. Ghost tilted his head at Mateo's voice and stepped forward until his nose touched the phone glass. Mateo grinned, missing tooth and all. Good boy, Ghost. You did your job. Ghost's ears eased for the first time all night. An hour later, after statements were signed and evidence receipts copied, Mrs. Klein brought Mateo to the staff entrance before school because he refused to leave without seeing Lena in person. No danger, just a child with a backpack and serious eyes walking fast down a clean corridor that no longer belonged to fear. He stopped short when he saw the bruises, swallowed hard, then climbed into Lena's careful one-arm hug and stayed there until his breathing matched hers. Drew started to step back, and Ghost moved first, pressing his head into Drew's chest with full weight, muzzle tucked under the edge of NWU fabric like he had done beside a coffin, in parking lots after nightmares, in every room where silence got too loud. Drew's scarred hand settled over Ghost's neck and stayed. No orders, no commands, just contact. The nurse who had first called for airway support walked past on her way to shift change and touched Lena's shoulder once. I filed my statement, she said. All of it. The pharmacist followed with a copy of the controlled substance discrepancy packet and set it in Lena's lap. Submitted to state and board, she said. Not internal only. The security supervisor came last, holding his cap in both hands. I should have keyed that radio sooner, he said. Lena met his eyes. You keyed it. It wasn't absolution. It was a fact. At 7:32 a.m., the investigator returned with final receipt numbers for every collected item. Syringe, swabs, badge log exports, camera mirrors, overwritten logbook page, tablet message capture, Kell's cuff sample, Evan's clothing, and Lena's injury photographs. She handed duplicates to Lena and Drew and said, Nothing disappears from this chain. Outside, school traffic started. Inside, the corridor lights hummed over clean tile where the night had broken open. Mateo took Lena's hand with one small fist and reached his other hand toward Ghost, who lowered his head so the boy could scratch the soft fur behind his ear. Drew watched them and finally exhaled all the way, the first full breath he had taken since 3:07. By then, the Sutherland name had already come off one set of doors, and everyone who mattered had learned why.